Welcome to this new series of 5 daily devotionals in the book of Numbers, part of our Growing Disciples course. In the month of February, we've focused on Israel's exodus out of slavery in Egypt, heading for the Promised Land. And when we get to Numbers, the 4th book of Moses' 5-part series, we're starting to rely now on our knowledge of the 3 previous books to understand the main characters and the overarching story. The book of Exodus finishes with Israel still camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, where a renewed covenant has been sealed between God and his people. The book of Leviticus then establishes the laws of sacrifice, priesthood and purity, surrounding the tabernacle, of course, the tented temple where God has taken up residence, involving, of course, some very detailed laws about how Israel will live with God, making his home in their midst. And so now we come to the book of Numbers, which strangely begins with Moses taking a census of Israel's fighting men. And so we read at the beginning of the book of Numbers, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. He said, 'Take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one. You and Aaron are to count according to their divisions, all the men in Israel who are 20 years old or more and able to serve in the army.'" So Israel is still near the base of Mount Sinai, where they seem to have been camping for about a year. And then this great census is taken and recorded, and there are long lists and names which you can read for yourself throughout Numbers chapter 1. But at a very high level, that census concludes like this in verse 44. "These were the men counted by Moses and Aaron and the 12 leaders of Israel, each one representing his family. All the Israelites 20 years old or more who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families. The total number was 603,550. And so what we learn is that the clan of about 70 people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, who went down to Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis, well, they have now grown into a nation with a potential army of over 600,000 men. Culturally, at that time, the women and children were not numbered, nor were they considered potential members of the army. Be that as it was, what we see here is that Israel is now getting organised. And as part of that, they need to know how many people they've got and to structure them into divisions with various roles. This organisational movement was also to be reflected in the way that the Israelite camp was set up and the way that the Israelites will travel and set up camp again, each with a defined role, with orders and positions. At the very centre of the camp was to be the tabernacle, with the Ark of the Covenant, with the altar and all the other ceremonial pieces, all with the special tabernacle tent. The tribe of the Levites had responsibility for this, and so they weren't counted as part of the army. What had happened actually is that the tribe of Joseph had divided into 2, and so they now had 12 tribes plus 1, the Levites. And of course there would be 3 tribes camped to the north of the tabernacle, 3 to the south, 3 to the west and 3 to the east. There was a signage program to direct people around the camp with banners for each tribe and each family within the tribe. So we see that the people of Israel were no longer a random rabble of slaves. They were an organised, numbered and disciplined army nation. But they were not like any other army because at their centre was the living God represented by the tabernacle. So this nation army of Israel was also a worshipping community, set apart for God and protected on every side. As a result of this, the nation of Israel were to be ritually pure and clean, being in covenant relationship with God as his holy nation and royal priesthood. Well, their behaviour, their way of life, their culture was meant to be radically different, radically good. as a means of demonstrating the greatness of God to the surrounding nations. And this was their responsibility under the covenant. As God blessed them, they would be a blessing to the surrounding nations. So ceremonial purity, consecration and loyalty to God were all very important for this reason, which also explains a series of further laws that are then recorded for us in the book of Numbers. Now, this interaction with other nations was, however, a bit of a two-edged sword. While God's long-term plan was for their good and for their blessing, there were some nearby nations whose persistent and outrageous sin meant they would never turn to God. They were in fact already destined for judgment. Military conflict with Israel is sure to follow, especially as the other big characteristic of Israel's organisation was that they were mobile. They were on their way to the promised land. So this was no time for them to settle down. Their mobility and their direction was always governed by God. And so in Numbers 9 we read this. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of covenant law, was set up, the cloud, you remember the glory cloud of God, covered it. From evening until morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That's how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days, or a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. All of this sets out one of the key themes, really, of the book of Numbers. And this book, as well as being an organisational manual for the nation, it's also a journey narrative. Israel are a people who must entrust themselves entirely to God's direction, believing his promises of protection, of land and of blessing. The journey narrative hinges on Israel's obedience to God and their belief in his promises. And this same journey narrative is fundamental to our lives as Christians. Like Israel, we have already been saved by a great salvation event. We look back to the cross in the same way that Israel looked back to the Passover and to the Red Sea crossing. Like Israel, we have been promised a future sanctuary, a home in the presence of God. We look forward to the new creation in the same way that Israel looked forward to their promised land. And in between the salvation event and the promised destination is this journey of faith and obedience. And for us, this is our current experience of the Christian life, with so many parallels through to Israel's journey in the wilderness, each of us with God in our midst. And so in our position in time between God's salvation event in Jesus Christ and his return to make his home and to live among his people, this tension between these two great God events opens up the interpretive key for the Christian reading the book of Numbers. And so as Christian people reading the narratives of the desert journey of Israel, we are right to ponder the challenges of faith and the rewards of obedience. And so let me leave you with some questions to ponder, which might give you some insights into your own life of daily discipleship. Israel was organised as an army ready to march at short notice. In what sense are you part of an army at the ready for God's command? Israel was organised with God at their very centre, the hub of their community life. In what sense is God the centre of your community life? Israel's journey was predicated on moving into God's promised land. In what sense is your life now shaped by your hope in the completion of God's salvation in the new creation? I leave you with those thoughts to prayerfully consider.